Lusitania would serve proudly for 8 years. However, the ship is best known for its final 18 minutes of life after she was torpedoed by U-20 at 2:10 p.m. on May 7, 1915. Since then, Lusitania has been residing on the seabed for over a century, but very little is known or at least understood about the wreckage. Now, interest in Lusitania's wreck spiked after the 1993 expedition to its wreck carried out by Dr. Robert Ballard, famous for discovering the wrecks of Titanic and Bismarck. Dr. Ballard and his team would collect nearly 80 hours of footage and several thousand photographs, from which Ken Marshall, a maritime painter, would paint large images showing the entirety of Lusitania's wreck, since the entire ship cannot be captured in a singular photo. Dr. Ballard would also publish a book on his expedition where he slightly discusses the final voyage of Lusitania, but mainly draws attention to Lusitania's wreck, since that's what the purpose of the book was, and he would also produce a series of conspiracies that were floating around before his time, and these would spread out into mainstream media, where they are now very popular and accepted as fact, even though they are actually false. Since Dr. Ballard's expedition, several other expeditions have been carried out where a level of photographs have been taken that show the deterioration of Lusitania over the last 30 years since Ballard was last at the wreck, and there are also a series of documents that were made available from preceding expeditions that go back as far as 5 decades from Dr. Ballard. Using all of the information available, it is actually possible to piece together what happened to Lusitania when it hit the seabed, and what has happened to it since then. Firstly, we must go back to May 7th, 1915. Just after 2:28 p.m., Lusitania is completely submerged, and the ship is almost at the bottom of the ocean already. The average depth for Lusitania's wreck is only 305 feet. Now, the ship sinks at this very awkward angle to where the entire thing is submerged before the vessel's bow actually makes contact with the seabed. However, the tips of the aft mast had just submerged by the time the bow is making contact with the ocean floor, and due to the angling, the ship actually breaks into 2 portions. This means Lusitania's hull is actually flexed into a V shape with a humongous separation between the area where funnels 3 and 4 once sat, as this is considered the ship's natural weak spot. On the A deck, you have the first class lounge. On B, C, and D decks, you have the first class dining saloon, and just below you have Boiler Room 4. These are all large open spaces which naturally have less supporting structure than the rest of the hull. There were also a series of locations across the ship where air had yet to escape by the time the ship became submerged, and since the air had no way out, it simply forced holes in the decks and hull in order to escape, which leaves us with a significant amount of small holes along the ship's entire length. Now, Lusitania's wreck remained undiscovered for 20 years, until in 1935 it was believed to have been located, though no dives were carried out until 1937, where it was confirmed it was in fact Lusitania. Later that year, there was going to be another dive which would take the first photographs of the wreck. However, this was cancelled due to talkings of the Second World War, since Germany had remilitarized the Rhineland, and the Hindenburg disaster had also happened and was eating up the newsfeed. The next time any serious expeditions on Lusitania's wreck could be carried out was in the early 1960s by an American named John Light, who had purchased the wreck from Liverpool for the measly sum of 1,000 pounds, which was equivalent to about $2,800 at the time. John Light's goal was simply to document the wreck to show how the ship's condition was, and largely he was unsuccessful at this goal due to needing extraordinarily short dive times, since he was using the improper mixture of compressed air for the depth he was working at. Regardless of this, Light would produce the first photographs and footage of the wreck ever taken, and by appearance, Lusitania was actually in extraordinary condition. This image here shows how Lusitania appeared when John Light took his footage and photographs. A few things you can note is the fracture in the hull between funnels 3 and 4, which was impact damage, and the superstructure below funnels 3 and 4 has also begun to collapse, and he also documents this hole just ahead of funnel 3 in the hull, which is not actually on the wreck. No one has been able to produce an explanation as to what John Light saw where he documented this hole. Lusitania's wreck would remain largely undisturbed for another 2 decades until 1982, when Oceanering International would begin a 6-week-long recovery effort to salvage large portions of the ship. This included 3 of the 4 propellers, several bulkheads from the upper superstructure, and various interior components, most of which came from the first-class lounge and first-class staircase. Now, this salvage operation was most certainly the biggest blow to the condition of Lusitania's wreck, as the operation would use explosives to remove the materials that the salvagers wanted to collect. They had intended to return to the wreck the next year. However, due to their lack of care with the ship the first time around, they were not allowed to go back and continue salvage work. Unfortunately, the damage had already been done. The superstructure had been blasted apart for its valuable metals. The stern of the ship, where the propellers were located, had also suffered a series of collapses from where explosives were used to remove the propellers. This means that the ship's bow, where the forecastle deck is located, was practically the only untouched location. But there actually was one important component collected from this salvage operation that helps form the history, and this was a couple of fuses, which was the first time there was public confirmation that Lusitania was in fact carrying ammunitions on her final voyage. Obviously, the next time Lusitania would be seen was in 1993 by Dr. Robert Ballard and his expedition team. Now, Ballard's team had to work with a largely collapsed and blasted apart ship, which, though is not the type of scenario any diver wants to see, this also helps him see components of the ship that would not normally be visible, such as the interior engineering spaces like Boiler Room 4. Something else that would become apparent during his expedition was more impact damage that had yet to be documented, and this was a lot of the hull plates on the lower bow had ripped away when the ship plunged into the sea floor. The hull plates that disconnected on impact are still in the mud just below the bow, and they are partially visible. And then we come up to today. It has been nearly 30 years since Dr. Ballard's expedition, and Lusitania's wreck has continued to degrade over time due to the severe weakening of the structure from the recovery operations and just natural deterioration from currents and salt water. When Ballard looked into Boiler Room 4, he could only see a riveting line on a boiler. However, today, entire boilers are actually exposed, and so are the turbine engines. Based off the photographs that have been made available in recent expeditions over the last 2 or so years, it's pretty safe to say that Lusitania's hull has almost entirely collapsed, and there are a lot of humongous openings across it now, to where you can look in and see the interior like never before. With that being said, that is the timeline for Lusitania's wreck and its deterioration. However, we will go in depth on each of these expeditions and the rate of deterioration of the ship in future parts. So, if you have enjoyed part 1 to Lusitania's wreck, why not leave a like and comment down below, and have a wonderful day.